Prime Minister Keir Starmer generated plenty of headlines at the Labour Party conference in late September when he set a new target of 2/3 of young people completing some form of higher level learning beyond school or college. Rather than hitting this target purely by expanding university degrees, the government has set an extra sub-target of ensuring that by 2040, at least 10% of young people pursue higher technical education or apprenticeships by age 25, a near doubling of today's figure. However, as two new reports from the Edge Foundation explained earlier in September, young people can face many barriers when trying to access apprenticeships, while employers can face many barriers when trying to recruit young apprentices, particularly small and medium-sized companies, often known as SMEs. So what are the barriers facing young people and employers? Should tackling these barriers be a local, regional or national responsibility? And is more funding the key to unlocking more apprenticeships for young people, or are there better solutions out there? My guests are Ambrose, the Chief Executive of the charity Workwhile, and Katy Dorman, the Apprenticeship Strategy Manager at Norfolk County Council. I'm Tom Richmond, and to hear more about the challenges facing apprentices and employers, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and apprenticeships. You can listen to all our past episodes, subscribe to future episodes, and get in touch by visiting insideyoured.com.
So here we are, a matter of days after the Prime Minister announced his big push for more apprenticeships for young people. But this comes off the back of what I think has been a rather uncomfortable journey that we've been on with young people starting apprenticeships in recent years. Anna, how would you describe what has happened to apprenticeship opportunities for young people over the past decade or so?
Well, I think the short answer, as you've alluded to, is that it's not an especially pretty picture. And a huge number of those opportunities have sadly just vanished. But maybe to give that a little bit more kind of context and detail. So apprenticeship starts dropped really significantly following the introduction of the apprenticeship levy and various other changes that came in 2017. We then had the impact of the pandemic, and those numbers have never recovered, even at that kind of headline. So in 2023-24, which I think is the last year that we have full figures for, apprenticeship starts were about 30% down on where they had been before the levy was introduced. But even looking at that overall number kind of masks quite a lot of what's going on underneath. So we've seen increases in higher and degree level apprenticeships. So that's those at level 4 and above, those offered by larger levy paying employers, and those that benefit generally older and better qualified learners. So those have all increased. And, just as an example, apprenticeships at level 4 and above have pretty much tripled since 2017. And it's interesting because thinking about the economics of that for a moment, those are generally more expensive apprenticeships. So if we're thinking about where the pot of money is going, it's just worth bearing that in mind. So then conversely, those apprenticeships at levels 2 and 3, those offered by SMEs and those benefiting younger learners, to come back to your question, those have dropped. So apprenticeships for young people since 2017 have declined by about a third. Those at level 2 have dropped by 73%, though that's a huge number as that kind of stepping stone into employment. And thinking about the economics of it again, those are the ones arguably that deliver the greatest labour market return. And Fabian's did some great work on this, which was published over the summer and demonstrated that. A lot of those trends have really been driven by SMEs dropping out of that apprenticeship landscape. So starts fell by around a half in SMEs between 16, 17 and 22, 23. And that accounts for a massive 97% of that decline in starts. So if you think about it, I always think about this as a bit of a Venn diagram, and it's kind of 3 really heavily overlapping circles between those level 2 and 3 apprenticeships, which really offer a bridge into work for young people moving out of education. So we've got the lower level apprenticeships, we've got those for young people, and we've got those in SMEs. And that is a very overlapping Venn diagram, if you like. So, in terms of overall numbers, that's where the not very pretty picture comes from. And I guess just a couple of slightly different points on that. That's not to take away from the fact that degree apprenticeships have increased. They have the potential to offer pathways into, what we might call kind of prestige professions for some of our young people. And of course, there are some really compelling stories of social mobility from people who have taken that pathway, who maybe wouldn't otherwise have gone to university and got into those professions. But in reality, Sutton Trust and others have shown, statistically speaking, that those opportunities are still generally reaching the same demographics as otherwise would go down that university route. So we have this great potential in degree apprenticeships. We've seen the increase in numbers, but perhaps if we want more of a kind of social mobility case to be made for them, they're not quite achieving that, statistically speaking, yet. And I think the other thing we might want to think about is quality, because some of the reforms that came alongside the introduction of the levy in 2017 were all about increasing quality. And, I think what young people experience now when they pursue an apprenticeship, quality has definitely increased over that period. So we've got the decline in numbers, but then perhaps some positive things to say as well.
Okay, so not a particularly happy picture, but maybe a few bright spots along the way. But of course, we had a change of government last July. Katy, what have we seen so far from the current government in terms of new policies or initiatives that could potentially increase the number of apprenticeship opportunities for young people?
Yes, there's been some recently announced policy changes that have definitely built on the existing support that we've seen for employers that are recruiting young people into apprenticeships. So if we pause for a minute and just think about the existing support that employers have access to, that includes the training, which is 100% funded by the government for apprentices that are up to the age of 22. We've also got the £1,000 age-based grant for supporting an apprenticeship for a young person aged 16 to 18 or up to the age of 24 if they have an education healthcare plan or if they're care experienced. And although many businesses still don't know about this little kind of silver lining, apprentices up to the age of 25 are also exempt from employer national insurance contributions, which can be a huge help, especially for small to medium-sized businesses. So there's already some good support there. But on top of this, there have been numerous recent policy changes that have included, for example, the Youth Guarantee. That's currently only delivered in 8 trailblazer areas. But that's enabling innovative pilots to identify the young people that are most at risk of falling out of education, employment or training and matching them up to local training or job opportunities. In apprenticeships specifically, we've seen emerging reforms. So Anna talked about the reforms of 2017. We're undergoing a sort of period of emerging reforms now. And we've seen those relating to off-the-job training requirements, also apprenticeship assessment, as well as new criteria now for functional skills qualifications, certainly for those that are aged over 19, and also the introduction of shorter duration apprenticeships. However, to go back to your question, Tom, I think the new product that has got the potential to be a real game changer for young people is the new foundation apprenticeship. So this is a new programme that will provide new jobs with training, initially in construction, engineering, health and social care and digital sectors. And these are programmes that are aimed at young people that are aged 16 to 21. They're pitched at level 2 with a minimum duration of 8 months. And there's actually an employer incentive that will go alongside that to help employers to, see the benefit or see the opportunity there to recruit and retain an apprentice. I think foundation apprenticeships will bring a number of benefits to the system, allowing young people that opportunity to develop a much wider understanding of a sector as opposed to a job role. So thinking about more of an industry opening, thinking about that stepping stone that Anna mentioned. Those stepping stones into full apprenticeships are really crucial to kind of bridge that step into work. So young people likely to then be moving into a level 3 apprenticeship while developing their employability skills and behaviours, a really, really important part of the foundation apprenticeship. They also bring a slightly more relaxed approach to functional skills. So whilst there is that importance continued in terms of doing the learning and continuing the learning, actually the removal of the achievement of functional skills as an exit requirement is a new addition to that particular approach. So foundation apprenticeships are really flexible. They're going to be this funded kind of entry point into the workforce, particularly for those that are not yet ready to start a full apprenticeship. There's possibly an opportunity there to really help support the NEET group, the young people that are not in education, employment or training. But I think it's going to be really important that we recognise that if those programmes are bridging that gap, we need to really carefully consider the holistic and wraparound support that will also be crucial from both employers and providers. Because we know, amongst other things, government data tells us that young people who are not in employment, educational training are also 80% more likely to have special educational needs or disabilities. They're nearly twice as likely to have a health condition, and they're twice as likely to have no previous qualifications or to be from a disadvantaged background. So I think they just give us a bit of an indication, really, that yes, there's a solution there, but it will still take some careful thought as to how they will work.
Okay, so it sounds as though the Labour government do recognise that action needs to be taken to help more young people into apprenticeships. But these two new reports from the Edge Foundation describe a whole host of reasons why it is not always easy to get young people onto an apprenticeship. I suppose the most obvious question is whether we are talking about a lack of supply or demand here. If we want to increase the number of young people going into apprenticeships, particularly in SMEs, is it the case that there is a lack of young people, or perhaps suitably qualified young people, expressing an interest in starting an apprenticeship? Or are we talking instead about a lack of employers being able and willing to hire a young person as an apprentice? Katy, in your experience, where does the main problem lie here? Do you think a lack of demand from employers is a bigger problem than a lack of young people being interested in apprenticeships?
I think if we look at the evidence, there was a recent report published by St Martin's Group, Stimulating Growth and Unlocking Supply, included some really interesting data from UCAS, modelling the evidence that actually demand is already outstripping supply. So the data showed that for every apprenticeship start in England, at least 4.4 individuals are interested in that opportunity. If you take that up to a level 4 or equivalent apprenticeship, that number increases to around 26 young people being interested in every single apprenticeship opportunity. So that really acknowledges that challenge between supply and demand. The report also acknowledged that there's going to be significantly more demand for apprenticeships by 2030 than there is now. So again, UCAS projecting that there could be up to an additional 160,000 individuals interested in an apprenticeship. So I think we can see that there are the applicants, there is the interest. I think the questions are they ready? Actually, coming back to the point on foundation apprenticeships, do we need to do more to create readiness for them to go into employment? But actually, coming back to your question, I think to have an apprenticeship, you need to have a real job, a paid job. And so we do need employers to offer those opportunities. Certainly in Norfolk in the last few years, we've seen a growing number of SMEs wanting to start apprenticeships, but that also is side by side with the amount of work that we as an apprenticeship hub put into trying to drive and stimulate that demand.
Anna, how do you see this balance between supply and demand? Where would you be most concerned if we want to try and boost the number of young people starting apprenticeships?
I think it's quite a complicated one. I think as Katy's alluded to, there is plenty of evidence that more young people very simply want to secure an apprenticeship than are able to do so. And we know that many large employers receive many more times the applications than the number of vacancies they've had, kind of 10 times the number of vacancies, more than that. We hear quite frequently some apprenticeship programmes are now more competitive than Russell Group universities, etc. And equally on the SME side, we've had some of the SMEs that we support at Workwhile really shocked by the flood of applications and struggling to manage that. So, that definitely suggests that the supply of applicants is perhaps not the issue. Equally, we know from our work that many of the SMEs that we support have apprenticeships that they struggle to fill. So either they're getting low numbers of applications or they're finding that those are very low quality. And I think it's really interesting, actually, that what we've found in our own research is that drives down the number of apprenticeships on offer further, because if an SME can't recruit, finds it hard to get good quality candidates, they simply don't bother offering more apprenticeships. So actually, they have that perception that there won't be good candidates and the number of apprenticeships available drops still further. So there is something really important to tackle there. And, as Edge report indicates, part of that is around how complex the pathways are for young people to find the most appropriate apprenticeships for them. So, very easy to find your way to a Google apprenticeship or an Amazon apprenticeship or whatever it might be, perhaps much harder to identify where there might be opportunities to give you that first opportunity to get into work in SMEs right across the country. We do have that bit of a kind of doom loop around supply and demand, perhaps. But I think a lot of what that indicates is a kind of disconnect in the system, for SMEs particularly, between recruiting employers and the young people who are seeking those opportunities. And, we can perhaps get into quite a lot of discussion there as well about the expectations and perhaps sometimes a mismatch of those between young people and employers. But I think, as Edge Foundation indicated, we also need to look at careers education here. I'm a school governor. My previous roles were an education charity working with schools. I'm absolutely not into bashing schools whatsoever. But I think Edge Foundation, Youth Employment UK's most recent Youth Voice census, lots of these sources show us that, young people looking for non-university pathways struggle to get the support and information they need. And those failings there are contributing to those kind of disconnects and mismatches. So I think, the answer to the question is quite complicated. And actually, there are some real kind of system level issues about how we better connect things.
Okay, well, let's turn our attention to how we can maybe better connect things, because the Edge Foundation's research found that it was not necessarily that there wasn't enough money or goodwill in the system, as you were saying, Anna, but there is sometimes a lack of support and coordination, both on the young people's side and on the employer side, even if they do express an interest in getting involved in apprenticeships. And that led the authors from the Edge Foundation to recommend a greater focus on brokerage services. And by that, I mean some kind of intermediary organisation that connects employers, training providers, and prospective apprentices. Anna, intermediary organisations trying to coordinate apprenticeships at a local level sounds very sensible, but how simple is this in reality? How easy is it for a brokerage service to make a genuine difference for young people and employers?
Maybe to start with that, it would be worth just talking a little bit about what we do at Workwhile. So we have grown out of a project called the London Progression Collaboration. We provide support for SMEs in London and beyond to access apprenticeships. And that ranges right throughout their kind of journey of interest in apprenticeships, from initial work to try and get more businesses interested in apprenticeships through supporting them to navigate the system. So knowing that where a large employer will have a head of apprenticeships and people with lots of experience of navigating that system, an SME looking at apprenticeships for the first time, it may be the managing director who's doing it. It is going to be somebody with lots of other responsibilities and probably not that specific apprenticeship expertise. So identifying the right apprenticeship standard that matches the job vacancy that they have, understanding the array of training providers that they have to choose from and thinking what the best match will be for their business. All those steps, understanding funding, etc., we can support them throughout that. And then, as you've alluded to, connecting them with, in our case, with other organisations that might have suitable candidates for them. So in our case, we don't have kind of lists of candidates seeking opportunities, but we work with lots of third sector and local government organisations who have candidates who are looking for roles. So that is the kind of thing that brokerage services, intermediary services, whatever we want to call them, are able to do. And I think you can think of that in two ways. So, if you think about the sales funnel and a kind of bucket of interest, the work that we and others in this space do can help to make that bucket of interested SMEs bigger, that work of kind of stimulating genuinely new appetite for apprenticeships. I would say that's the really hard part, finding those businesses who perhaps have had a bad experience, perhaps think for whatever reason they're not interested in apprenticeships. Just shouting the word apprenticeships at them more and more doesn't work. We have to be kind of cleverer about thinking what their challenges are, how apprenticeships can support them to navigate those challenges, all those kinds of things. But I think the other really important role is that we can plug a lot of holes in that bucket. So at the moment, what we see with SMEs is that if we start off with a large bucket of those that are interested, it's very leaky. We lose a lot of SMEs along the way because that journey is quite complicated, because some of the incentives within the system mean that training providers have to go after the larger employers, all of those kinds of things. So actually the role we can play is supporting employers so that we convert more of those that are interested into actual SME apprenticeship employers who are able to take on and support a young person. And ultimately, the limitations currently are around funding. As Edge Foundation highlighted, it is not really anybody's job in the system to be doing this work. And the result of that is that we've had a kind of organic growth of organisations like ourselves, a lot who've either worked within local government or have kind of emerged from local government, and some kind of sector-based projects as well. But that leaves lots of cold spots, lots of businesses that don't have access to that support. And arguably, when you get those cold spots, it's quite often where the support is most needed. And I think, the other barrier is that ultimately this isn't very fashionable work. It's not very trendy. It's not based on tech. It's based on people and relationships, because I think, a lot of us know that is what works. And that is, how to reach SMEs and how to support them really effectively. And ultimately, there's a price tag attached to that. But I think, what we've shown through all the case studies in Edge Foundation's report, through the work of members of the Apprenticeship Hub network, of which Katy's a leading light and we're a part as well, is that we know that this is a way of working with SMEs to create apprenticeships that really works.
Katy, Anna has described the leaky bucket challenge when it comes to getting young people into SME apprenticeships. How do you try and grapple with this in Norfolk? What are the challenges that you've encountered when you've tried to create that pipeline of apprentices right the way through to getting that final apprenticeship job?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, Anna's articulated it perfectly, to be honest. And we have a very similar approach in Norfolk. And I think it's really important to understand, that brokerage service and what that offers, because it is taking away the pain point for businesses. SMEs are time poor. So actually a hub approach, a brokerage service can drive a solution to that with a service that most importantly is really tailored to the business. And Anna mentioned the kind of people, not platform. It's the most important thing that we hear from businesses that we work with is they just want to talk to somebody who can give them completely free and completely impartial guidance. And that's practical guidance in terms of information and advice, anything from, which apprenticeship through to which provider, through to what does this look like financially for me as a business, but also the financial support. So a lot of the brokerage services that feature in case studies in the Edge Foundation's Agents of Change report deliver things like levy transfer schemes or incentives that have been funded through very, very localised UK shared prosperity funding. And those types of initiatives, those types of opportunities have made those real pockets of success, I think, where actually businesses have been able to say, do you know what, this made a difference. So an organisation that we helped, very small business, recognised that funding helped to plug the gap where a significant amount of time and effort is taken to train an apprentice. That affects their productivity as a business while they're training them. So the funding helps them to kind of cover that lost time that they can't be completing chargeable work. That's a really important thing for a micro or a small to medium-sized business. Anna picked up on the kind of need for inspiration. We can't just shout apprenticeships at a business and expect them to understand the impact or the benefits. So we developed, just after the pandemic, a campaign called Made in Norfolk. We're really proud of it. It's a TV advert and digital campaign, and it's really shining a light on SMEs in the county. So we have co-created it with real businesses who talk about the impact that apprenticeships have brought to their business. And then we target SMEs across the county through TV advertising and digital marketing, trying to drive that message home, which is, if we can do it, you can do it too. And it's really about inspiring other business owners to say, you know what, we were a micro business. We had 2 or 3 employees and we took on an apprentice and it actually was a game changer for us. We grew the business, we increased sales, we became more productive. Those are the messages that business owners need to hear in order to think that they can also see the benefits and the impact from doing so.
Well, you've both mentioned this point around inspiring employers, but this to me raises quite an interesting policy question, which is around responsibility. And Anna, I know you touched on this in your comments already. The Edge Foundation's research called for a national framework for brokerage services and funding from central government to try and tackle these cold spots where we have high rates of youth unemployment. But at the same time, the authors from the Edge Foundation were alive to the risk of duplication between different layers of government, the tension between trying to do this brokerage at a local level, but then we might also have intermediaries trying to work at a sector level, such as intermediaries for construction firms, as well as trying to have other intermediary organisations in the same space. So yes, there's a lot of desire, it seems, to get employers and young people closer together. But Katy, from your perspective, where does the responsibility lie for doing this? You're obviously working at a local level. Would you be delighted or slightly horrified if central government tried to get involved in how you deliver support to young people and apprentices in Norfolk?
I think there is absolutely a sweet spot to be had here between national level policy and consistency and coordination with regional boots on the ground that will deliver a flexible solution to the businesses that are in their local area. So I think there is absolutely an opportunity to develop a stronger model. We need investment. There is absolutely cold spots that are not covered by the existing hubs that we have in the National Apprenticeship Hub Network. However, what I would like to say is that through the National Apprenticeship Hub Network, which, as Anna mentioned, it's kind of organically grown out of a number of hubs that recognise that they're doing the same thing in different regional areas. There's a real community of practice there. There's a lot of knowledge exchange. There is a huge amount of evidence from projects that were funded 5, 6, 7+ years ago through ESF or ERDF funding or UK Shared Prosperity funding that are not necessarily funded through national funding through, for example, Department for Education, but actually the lessons learnt there could be really valuable in terms of central government being able to develop something that would work in a more coordinated way. So I think perhaps through devolution and through the kind of future, mechanisms there is more opportunity to have national investment without overly burdensome bureaucracy that has local flexibility. We have some impressive statistics already in different regions around England. And if we had more investment, we could do more of that. So following the Agents of Change report from Edge Foundation, we were looking at some data for them to see about the impact that hubs might have on their local area. And we found a really interesting piece of data where we were specifically looking at the proportion of new starts in non-levy paying sized businesses. So that's the small to medium sized businesses. So data that's published by the DfE found that both the Solent region and Norfolk have continued to outperform the national benchmark in that proportion of apprenticeship starts, in most cases with between 1 and 5 percentage points higher than the national benchmark. So if we're doing that with very small teams funded locally through local authorities, imagine what we could do if there was increased investment.
Very interesting case for change. Anna, how do you see this? What role is there for central government in this? Is it simply a question of money? We know that central government in the past has been quite reticent to hand over money without being able to control where that money goes. So what's the kind of model that you would like to see us moving towards, do you think?
I'd echo lots of what Katy said, really. I think to pick up on your point earlier about duplication, I think when we need to see such growth in apprenticeships, ultimately too much coverage is far better than too little coverage. And I think, central government clearly is not the place for determining how this work happens. I think it's really important that that happens on the ground in a way which is tailored, which focuses on specific need and opportunity, all the things we've talked about. But I think, clearly there is, I think, a role for central government in funding, as we've said, in ensuring that there is that universal coverage so that SMEs, wherever they are, whatever their sector, have access to that support. And I think with the right frameworks, I think that should be possible without, as we've kind of talked about, losing the strengths of the organic network that we currently have. I think there's a challenge here that what we need is to liberate those of us doing this work, those of us who, have the potential to do it in other places, all of this kind of thing, to innovate, to balance opportunity and need, etc. And I think with, typical national and government funding models, and Katy mentioned the bureaucracy that tends to go alongside with those models generally don't support innovation terribly well. They don't support risk-taking. So I think there's a real need to think, it isn't just about the quantity of funds available. Actually, it's about how that funding is structured, how that funding is deployed to really, liberate organisations who've got a track record of doing this, to do more of it, to support others to do more of it, all of that sort of thing. And I think with that right, people refer to kind of hub and spoke models, all those kind of things. I think with the right approach and the right kind of mechanisms for getting funding out to the right organisations, I think the potential that Edge Foundation have talked about is definitely there.
Okay, we are approaching the end of this episode, so it's time for my last question for today. The Prime Minister's new target of getting 2/3 of young people into higher level learning is very ambitious, and apprenticeships will need to be part of that solution. But of course, to get more people into apprenticeships at higher levels, we will almost certainly need more apprentices starting their training at lower levels, particularly in SMEs, to provide that pipeline that we've spoken about today to get them up to higher levels of learning and training. We know that the government is planning to replace the current apprenticeship levy with a new growth and skills levy next year, although we don't yet know exactly how this new levy will operate. So my question is, if ministers came to you and asked you for one way that they could use the upcoming growth and skills levy to increase the number of young apprentices in SMEs, what would you tell them to do? Katy, what would be your pitch to government ministers to create those new apprenticeships for young people?
I think for me, it would be create capacity to support young people in apprenticeships. But I think there needs to be a dual approach, because I think we know recruiting young people with no experience is seen as being difficult. It's often put on the too difficult pile. It's riskier. It's challenging to have the time. We've just talked about SMEs are time poor. They don't have as much resource. Therefore, to spend the time mentoring and really developing young people where that time is not charging income is a challenge. So being able to create capacity in a small business through the funding that we might be able to give them, for example, in an incentive, is really important. I think we've seen that worked post-pandemic. We've seen in Kickstart that there was elements of that working. We've also delivered local incentives in Norfolk for about 5 years now and have seen the impact of that. So I think incentivising employers is important. But I think we also need to reflect on the other part of the triangle. You know, this is not just the apprentice, this is not just the employer. We also need providers to be able to offer the training. And providers are also very challenged within constraints of tight funding bands. You know, signing up a cohort of apprentices with a levy-paying organisation who have a successful and well-established apprenticeship programme can be a lot less draining on their capacity than supporting a small to medium size or micro business that are taking on their first apprentice and possibly their first employee. So having some kind of uplift for SME engagement, I think might help to see those kind of market approaches change. Obviously, any type of financial incentive needs careful thought in terms of longer term sustainability. But I think with a decent investment over several years, we could see a real difference in the number of young people starting apprenticeships.
Thank you, Katy. Anna, what would be your one piece of advice to ministers to get SMEs hiring more young apprentices?
I mean, I think fundamentally, I would say make really sure there are no unintended consequences from changes to the Growth and Skills Levy, because I think we know that the overall apprenticeships budget is now quite stretched. And a lot of that is driven, as we talked about right at the beginning, by the growth in higher level apprenticeships, which tend to be more expensive. So there's a real risk through increased flexibility that actually that leaves much less of the budget available to SMEs through co-investment and potentially through levy transfer as well, which Katy mentioned earlier. So I think first and foremost, I think let's not throw any babies out with the bathwater and make changes to the Growth and Skills Levy that actually push SMEs further out of the system, because I think that's a big risk at the moment. But fundamentally beyond that, you know, when we're talking about SME apprenticeships, it isn't about the levy at all. And that's where all the things Katy suggested come into play. I've written a list and it looks pretty much the same as most of the things Katy said. I think incentivising providers or taking away the disincentives for them to work with SMEs is really important. And I think de-risking for SMEs the risk of taking on a young person with barriers to accessing work is really important. So many of the things Katy said, but fundamentally, let's make sure that the changes that are kind of coming down the pipeline in terms of the Growth and Skills Levy don't cause further problems before we even think about improving matters.
Thank you, Anna. And that brings us to the end of this episode. My thanks to Anna and Katy for setting out some of the challenges facing young people and employers in our apprenticeship system and what we might be able to do about those challenges too. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with others and leave a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join me when I next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.